From Evan Tanner's unfortunate death making Joe cry in his memory, to him contemplating the gruesome lengths he'd go to protect his daughter. Here are Joe Rogan's emotional reactions on his podcast that have left fans devastated. Joe Rogan rarely gets choked up on his podcast, but when he does, his fans can't bear to see it. That's exactly what happened on episode 1987 when he reminisced about the deceased fighter Evan Tanner with his guest Jelly Roll. Joe explained how fight commentators like himself have an emotional connection with fighters, and how every time he interviews them, he can see them bare their hearts and souls in the octagon. When Evan Tanner died, it affected him so deeply that he grew his beard out in his memory. Rogan explained Tanner's fascination with his lifestyle and his deep desire for self-exploration. The late fighter would go on walks to find himself in the wilderness. After attempting one in the hottest places on Earth, Death Valley, Tanner suffered a heat stroke and lost his senses, leading to his untimely death. The podcaster mentioned how unfortunate it is that no one got to witness how Tanner would have influenced the world. His love for his job of talking to people with different perspectives on life was on full display, as he imagined a future where he could have had Tanner on his podcast. His guest, Jelly Roll, joined in on Joe's grief, saying that he'd start crying too after hearing Joe talk about the fighter. The podcast ended on a happier note, saying that Evan's memory will forever be immortalized through Joe's kind words. Another death that brought Rogan to tears on the podcast was the passing of his dog, Johnny Cash, whom he'd raised since he was a puppy. If you've heard a second of Rogan's podcast, you know his love for animals. When his dog passed away, he broke down in tears just talking about it. Rogan explained how he'd grown up with the dog, not understanding how time passes by quicker for his furry friends. So by the time you realize your dog is about to pass away, it's often too late. What made it so sad for him was that the last few weeks of his dog's life were miserable because he couldn't walk anymore. When Rogan tried to make him stand up, the dog's legs would start trembling. That was a terrible sight for Rogan, especially because Johnny Cash was a Regency Mastiff, a breed known to be strong. As the podcast carried on, he told his guest, Bert Kreischer, how dreadful it was, deciding to put his dog out of his misery. He said that he'd realized that it would be wrong to make the dog suffer any longer. In a final act of love, Joe had to let go of his beloved pet. Speaking of Joe reminiscing, the podcaster revealed one of his greatest regrets about the late chef Anthony Bourdain. Anthony was a close friend of his. They'd done jiu-jitsu together, and he had an incredible impact on Rogan's life, who told everyone on the podcast how he found out about Bourdain's unfortunate death. Apparently, he'd woken up one day to see a message, thinking there was no chance of Bourdain getting into a celebrity jiu-jitsu match anymore. In his confusion, Joe checked the internet and found news that his friend had taken his own life. The podcaster talked about how it completely caught him off guard, because he'd talked to Anthony not too long ago and heard from his own mouth that he was the happiest he'd ever been. Joe came to realize he couldn't have known what Bourdain was going through just from that conversation, making him wish he treated Anthony better when the chef appeared as one of the first guests on Joe's podcast. Apparently, Bourdain was talking to Joe and started looking at the empty bottle of beer in his hand, and Rogan says that he still regrets to this day that he didn't realize Anthony wanted another beer, still feeling guilty after years had passed. After watching that clip, everyone felt an intense need to let their friends know they loved them. So Joe made sure when his friend Ari Shaffir opened up about being suicidal, he actually got the help he needed. Later, they both talked about their stories in a tear-jerking episode of the podcast. Apparently, after Ari told him he was suffering, Rogan did everything he could to prevent it. In the podcaster's words, Shaffir was such a non-complainer that when Joe noticed something was wrong with his leg, he waved it off like it was nothing. However, Rogan later found out that it was a brutal staph infection. So he knew if the comedian was reaching out for help, it must be a really serious situation. The podcaster said that the only obvious thing he could do was offer his financial support, which he immediately did. But after that, he had no idea how to help his friend. The popular commentator explained his nervousness and was getting choked up talking about it, saying he didn't want to see the day he'd get the call telling him that Ari had passed on. Rogan explained that he hadn't faced mental health problems, so he had no idea what his friend was going through, and that was making him really anxious. So when Ari mentioned problems with his psychiatrist, Joe reached out to his contacts to get him the help he really needed. The clip was extremely emotional, especially because Joe had succeeded in saving his friend's life, and talking about it on the podcast meant it was a chapter of their lives they'd left behind for good. On a much happier note, though, Rogan was moved to tears twice by the emotional championship win of Thug Rose Namajunas. After Rose fought Zhang Weili and knocked her out with a match-ending head kick in the first round, the commentator mentioned how he started crying as he went up to interview her, but was trying his best to hold back his tears, even on the podcast, just talking about it. He revealed that it was the first time he'd cried taking an interview, and how could he not? After all, Rose reclaiming her title was a great underdog story. He went on about Namajunas being an excellent example of a fighter, saluting her dedication because he was moved by the sheer focus Rose had shown by shaving her head to make sure it doesn't bother her in a fight. Rogan shed tears, discussing how her life as a warrior in the octagon mattered to her way more than looking pretty, and also explained how Rose almost goes into a trance before her fights, and has an insane ability to completely fixate on the opponent before her, only snapping out of it after winning. He also said how he admires that even though she is a talented technical fighter, there's nothing aggressive about her personality, and is actually uncontrollably nice. Because even after winning her fights, Rose gives heartwarming messages, telling everyone we have to be better people. No wonder he had listeners crying along with him in appreciation. But that was Joe showing his wholesome side on the show. He can also be equally intense if he needs to be. And his clip explaining the lengths he would go to if his daughter was in danger shows it all. This happened when he was talking to Bill Burr on his podcast. They started discussing a viral clip where a grown man in a bicycle suit violently grabs a little girl's arm and tears a piece of paper out of her hand as two adults try to stop him. Then, after joking about the stupidity of the cyclist's rage, the podcast host imagined what he'd do if the victim were to be his own daughter. And, well, he said the only answer would be murder, and then doubled down saying he'd be on the news the next day in an orange jumpsuit, implying that he'd be going to prison. This was followed by an intense gap in the conversation, and Bill realized how tense the vibe of the room was getting, so he tried to snap Joe out of it, reminding him that his daughter wasn't actually in danger and he could calm down. This was when Joe revealed to Bill that he went to a really dark place in his head. "I go there all the time, man," he said. After that clip, fans were shocked to see how dark their favorite podcast host's headspace can really be. So there you have it, Joe Rogan fans. From him contemplating the gruesome lengths he'd go to protect his daughter, to Evan Tanner's unfortunate death, making Joe tear up in his memory. Those were Joe Rogan's emotional reactions on his podcast that left fans devastated.